I'm not even including an intro to this one today. I have so much Minnesota fraud that I have been covering. I had to actually cut stuff out so I could get the best bits in. I'm trying to get you the hot gossip about Minnesota fraud here, people. I'm doing the suffering. I'm the one watching countless hours of Minnesota fraud House committee meetings, testimony from Keith Ellison, Walz. I didn't include that, don't worry. I'm watching this stuff so you don't have to, but I've come to bring you the wonderful gossip about Minnesota fraud so that you can go home and cry about it, because it's really sad, actually. But the truth is, we have to laugh a little bit here, people. We can't fall to feeling hopeless about this, because people are doing something. And one of the things that you can do right now is go to my Substack page, Lightning Up, or the Rundown Report, and subscribe. That helps me prove to my husband that I actually have a real job, and helps me provide the content that you crave so that you can have your Schadenfreude moments of looking at how terrible my state, Minnesota, is, and you can feel better about your state for a little while, or your country for a little while, until, of course, you're going to find out all of those same fraud schemes are happening where you live. I do include some swears in this one. Not really. I actually bleeped it out. I created my own bleeping, so just be ready for that. I do get all bent out of shape and mad about a couple things, so that'll be entertaining for you. Hey, if you ever have any questions, send me a message. Contact me through Substack. If you have a tip, send it to me. Either way, let's get started. So, since my last Fraudcast, there have been a number of things that have happened. First, Attorney General Keith Ellison met with Congress and the Senate to allow senators to get their little clips that they can use to send to their constituents to show that they're doing something about fraud, which is mostly just yelling at whomever they think is responsible. Consequently, since that time, Ellison had a little clip that somebody else made where Ellison sat on stage in front of all of these other people, asking for their vote and support, staring at his phone while this woman told her heart-rending story until an aide came in and tapped him on the shoulder and whispered in his ear. And he put his phone down for a very short time. Then, of course, he picked his phone back up again. So we'll see how it goes for him. A new report came out from Tim O'Malley, who is to be the new director of program integrity. The report confirmed Minnesota's long-standing, widespread fraud. This report indicates that some of these areas of fraud span back 50 years or more. Not great. He recommended a few obvious things, like we need to limit the opportunity for fraud to occur. Well, another obvious recommendation made by O'Malley includes an independent investigation. Oh, gee, that sounds pretty familiar. Gosh, didn't somebody come up with that? Oh, yeah, that's right. That was recommended by a bipartisan Senate bill last summer, and it was shot down in the House. The story behind it is that Walz wanted his own fraud plan to go through, so that independent bureau got smushed. O'Malley recommends using retired investigators as independent contractors who would assist in recovering lost assets. O'Malley recommended that the auditors could be paid with a percentage of money of the funds recovered from fraud for the state. I guess it sounds like a bounty hunter type of program. I mean, I could do that. Maybe. Of course, you're also incentivizing bad behavior with that too, or you get the fraudsters somehow becoming bounty hunters. I don't know. I could see that happening here in Minnesota as well. Other findings. Here's a quote directly from the report. The level of care available in facilities will not consistently meet requirements unless an active enforcement program exists. While some facilities may provide care exceeding standards, most will not make changes without surveillance. In my notes, when I was reading through that, I wrote derpity derp derp. So in other words, if Minnesota doesn't enforce the rules or have an oversight program, what generally happens is the breaking of law, lax standards, and growing fraud. I mean, it seems pretty obvious, but maybe it's not. O'Malley's report is most interesting when you go to the appendix, where they go over the lack of compliance through the years, especially with the Department of Human Services or DHS. You can see some laxity through the years until around 2009. And then DHS eats a turd sandwich constantly for its failures. The reports sound like the auditor is pulling out their hair because nothing has been addressed. It's like the non-compliant departments and those funding them almost want things to fall apart. Well, that's what the House Fraud Committee has been claiming for some time. Most Minnesota taxpayers might be asking, when does this become criminal negligence and complicity? No one did anything. So it starts to look as though they wanted the fraud to happen. Still, when you see clear incompetence and the only ones punished are those pointing out the fraud, you would think that the ruling party, in this case the DFL with Walz, will pay in the upcoming elections. However, the DFL only needs to talk about Operation Metro Surge a few times, and all of their incompetence or their party's incompetence is buried, and the supporters are back to ignoring the fraud. Another Minnesota fraud update includes a report by Optum, which is a subsidiary company of United Healthcare. Tim Walz got Optum to do an independent audit of the Medicaid fraud issues that the state was having. Optum found many violations. Now, they would not label the violations fraud. Sometimes the violations consisted of companies not meeting compliance standards. According to Optum, Minnesota could save the state up to $1 billion just by changing legislation and clarifying the requirements to receive payment. Optum's detailed information was only presented to DHS and the Walz administration. It's a little bit sus to me because they redacted a lot of information. There's politics happening. They won't communicate the details to the legislature, even though they're the only ones who can do something about it. The Minnesota voters would probably be interested in having those laws changed if it would save them $1 billion. Okay, another thing to note about the Optum report is it looked at only 14 flagged areas within Medicaid, so not all of the areas. Those were areas where DHS noticed a lot of possible fraud. In fact, about 90% of autism providers had compliance issues. Again, that's not necessarily fraud, but there were problems that DHS has not yet addressed. At the House Fraud Committee meeting on February 23rd with DHS, it was revealed that Shireen Gandhi is now being put forward as the head of DHS, not just the interim head. Again, Gandhi was the chief compliance officer when most of the fraud was happening. In this February meeting, DFL representatives along with GOP representatives seemed miffed that DHS is stringing them along. They want, for example, the Optum report, and they want it to be unredacted. Later, the witnesses for the fraud committee discussed the dire need to keep these services running. One witness, Brad Trehan, the parent of a 25-year-old son with autism, said, "Every official who helped create or allow to continue the now plainly visible culture of negligence within our state agencies must be held accountable." Okay. He said he accused the government of failing autistic families. Rather than blame just the federal government for withholding Medicaid, he felt the state should bear the blame for insufficient oversight. He also noted that accountability is personal for the families of autistic children. Well said. Nathaniel Olson also returned as a disability advocate to chide lawmakers for loss of services for the disabled, which has resulted in at least one Minnesota resident losing her housing and becoming homeless for 9 months. These stories are heartbreaking, but most testifiers would say the problems with autism do not come from a lack of compassion from the Minnesota people or the lawmakers. Rather, the cut services and fraud happened due to lack of enforcement by the government. One of the things noted by Bill Glenn of the American Experiment regarding O'Malley's press meeting, which happened after his report, O'Malley says, in Minnesota governance, we can try to lean on being compassionate first, which seems to be the case and what we've been doing for some time. Government employees want to take care of others, but O'Malley states, with his 50 years of fraud investigative experience, compassion often gets in the way of a more important function, compliance. If we allow all of this money to be wasted and it's not getting to the people who truly need it, We fail to be compassionate because we're not enforcing compliance. And O'Malley suggests that if you want to work on something related to compassion, you should leave the government and work for one of those organizations that works directly with people. And I think that makes a lot of sense. During the normal session, the Fraud Committee discussed fraud in autism facilities. DHS noted that 90% of autism services reviewed by Optum were flagged for compliance problems. It means that they have to look over 90% of the providers in their system. Even though the rates of autism diagnosis have gone up quite a bit, the rates of autism providers has gone up 3,000% in Minnesota from 2018 to 2024. In the past, most providers of autism care were unlicensed, but providers have until May 31st this year to submit licenses. As of February, only 6 of 500 providers have applied for licensure. DHS reported having done 338 autism site visits, but very few, if any, were unannounced. They said they must give notice thanks to legislative statutes. At minimum 24 hours notice and 30 to 60 days in most cases. The state law didn't require these autism providers to be licensed, or at least they wanted them to be, but they didn't have to be. They can only do unannounced visits for licensed providers, and only 6 have applied. DHS claim that they license providers and they give them adequate oversight. However, when Representative Schultz asked if DHS verifies details of qualified service professionals, or QSPs, who are meant to provide oversight at autism centers, we found that QSP providers are supposed to have mental health credentials. But when asked further if DHS checks to see if those credentials are real, we learned that providers attest and give copies of documents. In short, attestation is allowed for the credentials of people responsible for overseeing the medical care at these autism centers. So that means that no one inside the Minnesota government is checking. Documentation is required, but it isn't a sufficient guard anymore against fraud. They're not checking things unless there are clear signs of fraud. DHS didn't even know if QSPs were diagnosing the kids at these centers. As Representative Robbins said, the QSPs might be giving diagnosis at these centers, and they might be incentivized to set the maximum level of care for patients so that center can rake in more federal dollars. The fraudulent service providers that have already been found are often trying to get the maximum amount of federal dollars and paying people kickbacks to have their kid qualified for tons of service. Such a scheme was used at the Star Autism Center, which was a St. Cloud, Minnesota facility, where Abdel-Najib Hassan Yusuf pled guilty to fraud on March 2nd. Parents were paid kickbacks and had their children diagnosed with the highest level of autism for the highest level of care at this particular facility. So this isn't coming out of left field. We already have fraud scams actually happening. Another thing to note is they weren't doing background checks on many of the people providing hands-on care for autism services, which is unconscionable given the fact that these are vulnerable children and adults. It's clear that DHS has the ability to send out money, but they don't seem to have the ability, will, or inclination to monitor recipients or prevent fraud. Systems aren't built for those law-abiding, reasonable folks. They're usually built to keep out the bad actors. It's questionable with the Fraud Committee that they need exact statutory requirements written in law to tell them exactly what they can and cannot do in terms of fraud. Representative Schultz called this out when he said, just do your job. Do your job. In other words, you're using this as a shield, this tactic that if I don't have explicit authority, then I can't do something. This might be because they've faced many different lawsuits in the past, such as when fraudsters in the Feeding Our Future scheme had the audacity to sue the Minnesota state government for stop payments. Not only do people rip off the government, then they have the cojones to sue the government if they try to stop them for fraud. Maybe we need to look at how courts are ruling. If you remember with that Feeding Our Future lawsuit, a judge initially advised the state to pay the scammers before the FBI and federal attorneys intervened. We are seeing problems with the fraud cases that are being prosecuted, including a case that overturned a unanimous conviction of Abdefata Yusuf by Hennepin County Judge Sarah West. In that particular fraud case, a case against Yusuf's wife, Lou Ahmed, was dismissed by Judge Amber Brennan. A co-defendant in the fraud case, Abdueli Muhammad, that case was dismissed by Judge Hillary Caliguri. We're seeing, at least surrounding this case, a whole bunch of these fraud allegations, even when they are brought to a jury trial, are being dismissed or being overturned by judges. The Sarah West case was so extreme that Attorney General Keith Ellison is actually appealing West's dismissal. That's how bad this ruling is. Even in the Feeding Our Future cases, which are still going through the courts, there are 3 separate cases that the defendants have either pled guilty or have been found guilty and were given probation as a sentence. That's it. No prison time, no nothing. Alongside that was forfeiture of fraud money that they had that they'd been found guilty for. So that basically tells Minnesotans that if they wanted to, they could steal millions of dollars and have nothing happen. You get no prison time. You're expected to pay it back if you get caught, but you're probably not going to go to prison. I don't know if that's the best way to run a state. Another thing that is a mess was the city's church protest or incursion, depending on how you view it, that happened in St. Paul and involved everyone's favorite journalist, Don Lemon, along with the Twin Cities Black Lives Matter group, who are facing prison time for violation of various federal statutes related to freedom of religion, one of those First Amendment rights. Now, this is the part that makes me all sad inside. Joe Thompson, who was one of the lead attorneys for the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Twin Cities, who were looking into the fraud for the federal government, he and a few other attorneys left. But part of the problem is Thompson was one of the top people in charge of fraud investigations and prosecutions in Minnesota, and he left. So that's not great. And allegedly, he and a number of people resigned after clashing with the Justice Department over its handling of the investigation into the killing of Renee Good. They felt like the Department of Justice were doing things they didn't agree with rather than what they had been doing, which is looking into fraud. So a number of them resigned. Now, Thompson and his other former U.S. attorney partner, Harry Jacobs, not related to me, they started their own firm. He is the attorney that's going to be representing Don Lemon alongside Abby Lowell. And that makes sense because Don Lemon actually has the best case of all of them in that he is claiming that as a journalist, he has First Amendment rights that are protected. I mean, I have opinions about that myself, but we'll see what ends up happening with that trial. At the March 23rd meeting of the House Fraud Committee, Scott Stillman was invited to testify. Now, if you remember, Scott Stillman is a controversial figure. In 2018, he worked with Fox 9 on a report about money flowing out of Minnesota, totaling around $100 million through the Minneapolis-St. Paul International Airport, going to fund terrorism and going into various places in the Middle East and Africa. When the Minnesota state government looked into that, they found Scott Stillman as the main whistleblower working inside of DHS, and this caused massive chaos. Instead of rewarding whistleblowing and protecting their whistleblowers, DHS decided to attack them. Stillman was punished severely for speaking out. The then DHS Inspector General, Carolyn Ham, spent $90,000 on a consulting firm to basically investigate people working at DHS and to investigate the investigators. Stillman, in his testimony at the Fraud Committee, stated he was forced by the Attorney General and DHS to sign an agreement saying that he had lied, exaggerated, his name was smeared. He was forced out and retaliated against. Now, this, when it came out, ended up resulting in Carolyn Ham's resignation. She still denies that that's what was behind it, but soon after she resigned, when it came out, she paid a consulting firm who Stillman said none of those people at that consulting firm had any investigative experience. The OLA interviewed him, and they came out of course, with the 2019 report. It said that he had been mistreated and that they weren't able to find the $100 million that he talked about, sadly. But the OLA did state in its report that there were signs of significant fraud. Not too long after that OLA report, we ended up with the Feeding Our Future fraud, which is still ongoing. Furthermore, after various whistleblowers have testified to the Fraud Committee and testified to other legislators, we find out that there was massive retaliation and a chilling effect throughout DHS to discourage reporting fraud. Now, in Stillman's testimony, some of the representatives still pointed to certain records that his statements didn't match up, that he had made things up, and that he had been discounted. But there's also statements within the government and the OLA saying that Stillman was honorable, he was intelligent, he was a good investigator. So you have various points of view, and you have Stillman saying that he was very poorly treated. That, if so, is a travesty. And the fact is, since we're starting to see large-scale fraud, most of it having been found by the federal government, we need to start questioning what exactly is going on, particularly in DHS. In Stillman's interview with News Nation, he suggested that there were people within the Minnesota state government that were receiving money. He didn't name them, but he suggested that that was happening. There's been so much overlooking and so many just terrible cases. I'm starting to wonder what's happening. And that brings us to what happened yesterday. Tuesday, April 28th, I woke up to hear that 22 different sites in the Twin Cities metro area had been raided by federal agents, so FBI and other investigative units, to remove various files. Nobody was arrested. Subpoenas were served. Warrants were shown. They had everything in order. The scene was pretty quiet because they ended up going out at like 5, 6, 7 a.m. Yeah, and all you saw were officers carrying out large boxes of files. Now, it just so happened that later that afternoon, the Fraud Committee was meeting. And it just so happened that they were inviting and interviewing the head of the Child Care Assistance Program, which is now no longer in DHS. It is now in the Department of Children, Health and Families, which is DCYF, Youth and Families. Representative Robbins, the chair, talked about how DHS and people who were formerly involved with child care programs declined to come. The head of DCYF, Tiki Brown, and the new head of Office of Inspector General at DCYF, who is Randy Keyes, attended. And Tiki Brown noted that the state and allegedly BCA, along with federal officers, worked together and saw the 22 childcare centers, which were raided mostly by the FBI. Of those 22 childcare centers, they had received $386 million in federal or state funding that was allegedly going to 12,000 families. Now, of course, if you break that down with a handy-dandy little calculator, you'll see that 12,000 families at $386 million is $32,166 per family. Furthermore, if you divide that number by 22 sites, that's $17 million per site. What the hell? That's the thing. It's so outrageous. I did see some of the local journalists covering the raids, and it showed one of the owners or managers of one of the sites. And just like the ones that Nick Shirley visited, it was a man. I mean, I don't even want to hear your BS about, oh, men can run daycare centers. Okay, fine. I have known one provider in my life. I mean, he's the only person I ever met that worked at a childcare center. I never knew any childcare centers or home daycare centers that were run by men. I mean, I have never seen a childcare center, at least if I did, and it was making $17 million a year. I would have big questions about that. Like, that's insane. And this is where the fraud committee started to go off the rails. Then they invited Jay Swanson, the former manager of DHS Child Care Provider Investigative Unit, who has been retired, to testify. Now, Jay Swanson worked with Scott Stillman. He actually provided testimony to support Stillman's findings in the OLA report 19. Now, he was very detailed and very precise. Swanson shared crazy stories about investigation into this widespread fraud. He got calls from people complaining about how some child care provider had forgotten to pay them their kickback, or how a former co-owner called to complain that he was cheated out of his share of the proceeds of a child care center. Then a fireman called to complain how he couldn't inspect a facility because no one was ever there when he showed up. No children, no nothing. And that center had been receiving $1 million in the month prior to when this fireman talked to Jay Swanson. And it was billing for 90 children 7 days per week. And Swanson talks about how when he started, they were prioritizing investigating the fraud based on amount of money that they were getting. So they were focusing on the largest sources of fraud first. Because they had so many tips and allegations of fraud, they didn't have enough investigators to look into it. Fraud was passed to the BCA. Warrants were issued. Payments were stopped. They began to track texts and emails between various people that were suspected of committing fraud. He shared an example of a text. "Oh, how much longer are you going to do the daycare scam?" said one person. And the other person responded, "A year or two. I'm going to buy some nice homes in Nairobi." Oh, that's nice. And by the way, the person that was talking about their wonderful scam was on public assistance. And not only that, that jerkwad was on a vacation in Dubai when he sent the text. He said the stop payments always resulted in the closure of a center because none of these centers had private clients. They only had public assistance. Jay Swanson revealed that some of these people first heard about doing daycare scams when they were in refugee camps in Kenya. It was well known and shared that Minnesota was the easiest place to run a scam and to make the most money of any place in the world. So people were coming to Minnesota for that specific reason. In his time, the Salama daycare was convicted, and I talked about that in a previous Fraudcast. Immediately after it closed, in that same location, the Quality Leering Center opened up. This guy who worked at DHS, who was an investigator, saw it and tried to pass that information on. Did anybody care? No. Oh, I'm wrong. They did care. So when he started to communicate with the Office of Legislative Auditor, OLA, a senior DHS officer suddenly came to his office. He was directed by one of these DHS senior officials to delete paragraphs of the document with specific information about the fraud. He declined to do that and saying that that's illegal. Now, the same official told him that the DHS commissioner was sending his document to the OLA and that he better be ready for a bleep storm. Here's some of the retaliation that happened through DHS. We know about the $90,000 to investigate the investigators and to find out that, of course, Stillman and Swanson were unreliable and all of their allegations were unable to be proven. False derogatory information was put out on a supervisor's review by DHS. Probably he's referring to Scott Stillman at this point. Continuous improvement programs were started, and that consisted of berating the investigators, telling them that they were incompetent. They were given constant homework and had constant meetings that kept them from actually investigating. Now they decided that prioritizing by funding would not be allowed. And of course, they were bound up in investigating small-time fraud, so they were getting very low numbers in terms of fraud. Made it look like there wasn't really a lot of fraud. I mean, they did find fraud, but it was pretty small. Well, that's because their process suddenly changed. And BCA would no longer have an office at DHS. And that's when the dude, Swanson, decided he was going to retire. Swanson talked about how things changed from when he started in 2014 to about 2016, 2017. And that's when they started implementing crackdowns and that had a massive chilling effect at DHS on reporting of any fraud. What a surprise. He was asked if some of these raids could have been prevented. And he said yes, because the number of centers in Hennepin County alone was 320, and many of them were thought to be fraudulent. Some of the red flags that they would have looked at would be recruiting moms with lots of kids, having childcare open 7 days a week, 18 hours a day, starting with billing at $800,000 per year and then going up to millions after that, having people with no experience in childcare managing or running these childcare centers again, but people were overlooking them. He stated that he's still in contact with people who are investigating, and they talk about how they can't investigate fast enough because what often happens is one shuts down, and you get a relative or a friend to open the next one in the same location. Nothing is needed, and it keeps happening. It's like whack-a-mole. But Representative Schultz jumped in there and talked about how the top CCAP recipient received $4.12 million in reimbursements with 137 kids. That's $35,000 per child. And if he actually said that is billing at the maximum weekly rate for infants for every day of the entire year. So you would have to have infants filling up this space. In other words, it's just not statistically possible. When people look into the Minnesota fraud and the California frauds and the Maine frauds, they're going to see how poorly these are planned out, how blatant they are, and how they keep happening. And what keeps happening is the same grift for the past 10 or more years. Representative Robbins asked him about the Minnesota Minority Child Care Association that wanted to limit oversight. There was evidence that they had admitted to using kickbacks in their businesses. Swanson had not wanted to go to any meetings. They had fraud investigations opened on some of the people who attended. He discussed a meeting he attended with DHS. One of the people that was there started shouting and telling him, I'm going to tell you how you're going to investigate fraud. I will tell you what centers to investigate. He demanded that Swanson give him his cell phone number so that he could control which centers get shut down. So that sounds exactly like a mafia operation. And unsurprisingly, 2 members of the MMCA are now convicted of fraud with the Feeding Our Future fraud. And they found evidence of kickbacks, corruption, involvement with the government. But Swanson said that the meetings with MMCA continued. Representative Anderson pointed out that there are far less convictions, far less referrals to law enforcement. Instead, what's increased is the number of administrative sanctions. Swanson said, if you don't have criminal penalties within the state, the owner just gets anybody they know to open a new center, and then boom, they keep getting money. Representative Robbins talked about the Creative Minds Center as the #1 CCAP recipient and guilty of Feeding Our Future fraud. It closed in October. The same day at the same location, Super Kids Center opened up, and the new one billed $471,000. And unsurprisingly, they were raided by the federal government yesterday. And she asked, how does this even happen? She's asking now Inspector Keys and Kiki Brown. They didn't have a very good answer about that. Well, changes in ownership require a licensing application and review. What the hell? And this is exactly the kind of response that you got from DHS. Well, the paperwork was correctly done, therefore it's not fraud. So in this age of AI, where you can make up fake documents, you can have AI fill out your forms perfectly, you can have AI file your LLC paperwork, why is DHS and DCYF, the new child care fraud center, the new child care money center, why are they operating like 20 years ago? And of course, Representative Pinto seems to be like, I'm sure it's just really hard to get convictions. Yeah, okay, Pinto, but how about maybe stopping our money going out? You said you were going to do that 5 years ago. You haven't done bleep. And then he later talked about, are we supposed to trust the word of Kash Patel? Well, I'm not a big fan of Kash Patel, honestly, or I wasn't a fan of other people in the federal government that were working on the situation. But the truth is, when I see how poor of a job that Minnesota has done, continues to do, and seems set on doing, I don't really care anymore. You guys can all suck at bleep. You suck at your jobs. I don't care. Have Kash Patel, crazy eye Kash Patel, come in and do it. He's went on, even if we know that they might be doing something bad, we still have to let them go ahead with it if they have all their paperwork correct. Why? What? And that's the moment that the fraud committee switched to showing Tiki Brown the clip from the Quality Leering Center after the Nick Shirley fraud video dropped. You'll remember Tiki Brown as the one that said, oh, the Quality Leering Center is closed. There were lots of news reports that said, wait a second, you said it was closed, but now there's kids that are showing up. What's going on? And here we got sort of an answer about that. On the 19th, they got information from the Quality Learning Center that they were shutting down. The clip was made on the 29th of December, and she referenced that they were going to close because that's information they had. But investigators visited, and then the Quality Leering Center said, oh, no, we're going to stay open. And apparently, their investigators were just like, okay, cool. And then on January 6th, they requested to close finally. Then they were just like, okay, cool. They asked, well, okay, so they weren't shut down by your department? Well, they said, we didn't find any findings of fraud. And recall that the Quality Leering Center opened up, I think, the day after the Slama Child Care Center was shut down for fraud. They said they didn't have any fraud. Somehow, the Quality Leering Center, or whatever they're now calling themselves, was raided yesterday by the federal government. Representative Schultz really said, you're straight up lying to people. You're not enforcing the law. You're allowing money to flow to fraudsters. And to Kiki Brown, I believe he was saying, I don't know why you haven't resigned already. Now, Pinto had to put down Kash Patel, and he was bewildered by this approach. Oh, really, Representative Pinto, you've sat there and listened to all these and you're suddenly bewildered. Of course, you've been a representative this whole time since 2014. So you knew about all of this, or you knew something about it. You at least know something now. And yet all you have to say is, I'm bewildered. Oh, really? Okay. Of course, Pinto always says, rooting out fraud is important. Like he's got it written on a card in front of him just in case he forgets to say it. And we must improve integrity. And I'm concerned. But he's saying Nick Shirley is the reason why our state suffered. Kash Patel is the one that's lying. And that, of course, Tim Walz, savior of the DFL party, is the one that's telling the truth. I don't know. I think a lot of the evidence shows otherwise. It makes me wonder about how great of a lawyer Pinto was if he can't see the evidence that's been laid out before him. And he certainly can't make an argument that's convincing to me that this is not happening. And lastly, Alpha News covered a story in a place that's near and dear to my heart, Rochester, Minnesota, at a building called the 1500 building. The problem is there seems to be an inordinate number of non-emergency medical transportation businesses located at this place, like Sunflower Transport, Swift Ride Transportation, Helpful Transportation, Hannibal Transportation. There are a couple of other things that are questionable from a right-wing news source, of course, like Alpha News, which is that they have the Olmsted County DFL office in Suite A. So, but really the non-medical emergency transportation places are very concerning because those are being investigated for Medicaid-related fraud right now. One of the companies, which is called Kadar Transport, is operated by someone who has lost their adult foster care license and home community-based services license. They're implying that this should be investigated further, that this person owns multiple businesses. They have 2 $500,000 houses in Rochester, and this might be something worth looking into. Now, I'm not suggesting that that's fraud, but it is awfully suspicious. It reminds me of this this location that's in the middle of nowhere out in Rochester, where they have had like a whole bunch of just random businesses. Like they had the sandwich shop that I pulled into with my kids one time. They didn't have any food there. Now they have like a dry cleaning facility, and they had something else in between. Nothing is ever happening there. It looks like, okay, that must be a place where they're like actually selling drugs, or they're like they're doing something. It's a shell company, a place that somebody owns so that they can launder money. I don't know. Maybe it's not, but places like that exist all over the country. The fact that Nick Shirley and a lot of these Minnesota businesses have really brought attention to that is, I don't know. I guess it's the level that the fraud is happening at and like how stupid it is. That's just, it's so, it's so bad. Yes, I'll be interested to find out what happens with this new raid with the federal investigations into fraud, because they promised that was happening. And then Metro Surge happened, and it was a total bleep show in Minnesota. It felt like the fraud investigations that they were supposed to be there were suddenly out the door. I've heard from a lot of families that saw what happened then, are losing Medicaid funding, concerned about their autistic families and their autistic kids. They're worried about, okay, who is going to be standing up for me? Am I supposed to believe them? The Minnesota government says everything's fine. They don't even use the word fraud anymore when they talk about it. Of course, only when they can take credit for prosecuting fraud. So it's only fraud if they can get credit for it, apparently. Regardless, we have an election coming up, and people can decide at that point based on what someone's stance is about this fraud. Ask the people who are wanting your vote. Ask them what they think of the fraud. What do they think of the problems within the Minnesota state government, within DHS, within this new organization to manage child care funds? Ask them what they think about the convictions that have resulted in lame sentences or dismissals. Ask them what they think of the Democratic Party in Minnesota flip-flopping and ask them what they think of the Republicans' failure to do anything about the fraud that's happened. Ask them. That's your duty as a voter. That's all I can say about it. To all of you who've listened, I hope I didn't scare you away with my bad language at the end, but man, I'm so sick of this. I hope that you learned something about what's been happening in terms of Minnesota fraud during this time. The next things that I may look at will circle around education. That's something that I didn't cover. Until then, please go to Substack, subscribe to Lightning Up, and subscribe to the Rundown Report, of course. I will do my best to keep on top of this. Say hi. I love hearing from people. Anyways, take care. Bye.